All right, good morning, everybody. Let's get started in our final week in this class. One quick bit of housekeeping. I have put up online under exam review 3, the similar type of study guide set of sort of questions that I expect you to know. And I'll address those at the end this morning. I'll just give a quick overview of that for your final exam on Thursday. Oh, excuse me. Too many hours watching the Olympics. So I'll do that at the end of class this morning, and then you'll get a better sense of what's coming up in that final exam. Anybody got any questions at the moment? Any issues or questions or housekeeping things? All good. Again, just a reminder that your written piece, your op-ed, is due on Friday evening. So try and get that in, or certainly you need to get that in by Friday evening. And if you want me, as I said last week, if you want me to take a quick look at it, give you some feedback, I would be happy to do that. Okay, so this morning, I want to finish off the material on biodiversity, and then I also want to talk a little bit, spend some time talking about the rhino conservation work that we're doing in South Africa. So sort of a case study, if you like, on biodiversity. Let's see how far that goes, see how long that takes us. That may take us all the way to the first break. And then if that does, we'll grab a coffee break and then come back and move onto chapter 9. Okay, so we ended off on this slide here, and I don't want to go and revisit necessarily this question about how much is nature worth, even though that's many would argue that's an important thing to do, is to try and put a price on nature, on our wildlife. And the argument there is that unless we do that, we won't know what is worth saving. Of course, others have an inherent problem with that. What I wanted to move on here is to look at just briefly what threatens biodiversity and some of the issues and concerns. So extinction, like climate change and many of the other topics here, has a natural and a human fingerprint to it. So extinction is a natural process, right? The evolution, the speciation, and sorry, I've just got a text that I need to just ignore there. So extinction is a normal natural background process. And it accounts for something like 95% of all extinctions, right? Species, we don't really know how long species survive. Some survive longer than others. But the natural extinction that we see is punctuated by these mass extinctions, right? These periods of catastrophic species decline. And again, I don't want to go through the various mass extinctions that we've experienced in the past, other than to say we think, the geologic and the fossil record seems to suggest that we've had 5 periods of mass extinction. The last one, which occurred about 65 million years ago, was when the dinosaurs died out. And the image on the right here, incidentally, this is the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. And this here is apparently the impact site for the crater for that last meteorite that impacted Earth, changed global climates. There's a strong argument that the dinosaurs themselves were already on the road to extinction, and that this impact crater just kind of accelerated that, right? But the point here at the outset is just to appreciate that extinction is indeed a natural process, right? It's an ongoing natural process. What is of great concern and relevant to this course is anthropogenic extinction, right? So how many species are going extinct because of human activity? And there are any number of species around the world that have gone extinct due to human activity. How fast are we losing species relative to the background rate? folks, that's another one of these difficult questions, right, to answer. In the blue box at the top right-hand side here is just an estimate of the natural rates of species extinction. So the research suggests that we should lose about 2 mammals per 10,000 species per 100 years. There's no need at all to remember that, other than to appreciate that that rate of species extinction, right, a couple of mammal species per 10,000 every 100 years, we think is far slower than what we're currently experiencing, right? The literature suggests that we're losing species at a rate that is probably 100 times faster than the normal rate, and maybe considerably much faster than that, largely due to habitat fragmentation and a whole range of other reasons. So that's the key driver here. Well, that's the key point, at least, is that we've got this natural rate of extinction accelerated by human activity, right? The appropriation of land for agriculture and industrialization and urbanization and consumption. Now, there is a really important distinction here between a species that is threatened and endangered. And the title of the slide here, as you can see, is called Listing a Species. So what does that mean? So in the US, we have an endangered species list, right? This was put into place in 1973 by the Endangered Species Act, an act that was passed by Congress. And anybody, any citizen, can write to the US Fish and Wildlife Service, that's the organization that manages this list, and recommend that a species be put on that, or at least recommend that a species be considered for the endangered species listing. That doesn't mean at all that they will automatically do that. It just simply means that if they receive a request that seems legitimate, that a species may indeed be under threat, then it goes through a 90-day review and it goes through public discussion. They look at any of the research that's been done on that particular species. And it's quite a lengthy process, to be honest. But you and I as citizens are open to doing that. If a species, if the numbers in a population are low, but the scientific community determines that that species is less likely to go extinct in the near term, then it's called threatened, right? But if the population numbers are so low that extinction is imminent within, and there's no specific timeline as to what imminent means, then a species is listed as endangered. So those are the two critical definitions here: threatened or endangered. Endangered is just one level up on the endangered species listing. So that's the US endangered species list. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature manages something different, and I'll refer to that in just a second here. So the Endangered Species Act, which has been reviewed a few times, is actually pretty controversial because if a species gets put onto the endangered species list, then in effect, all development stops. And one example I'll give you is a few years ago, there was a wind developer, an energy developer in West Virginia that was putting up a wind farm. I think it was about 70 or so turbines on this wind farm. And they hadn't done due diligence, and what they hadn't done prior to putting the wind farm up is an environmental impact assessment to see if there were any threatened or endangered species in the vicinity of the wind farm. And literally months before that wind farm was completed, they found some nests of a bird called the black-capped vireo. It's a little tiny bird, and it's on the endangered species list, and that totally shut down the wind farm. They weren't allowed to continue development. So it's a very powerful piece of legislation, and there are some people who feel quite strongly that it's too powerful, that it is too limiting in terms of development. But that's the US situation. I made mention of this when we first got together. The situation with birds, mammals, and amphibians. This is just to kind of expound upon that for just a minute here. So Remember, everybody, that we've had about 1.7 to 1.9 million species cataloged, okay, but far fewer than those have actually been assessed as to their conservation status, right? So it's one thing to identify a species and name it and catalog it. It's a whole other thing to actually really get to the science behind whether that species is under threat or not. So the global repository of all of this then is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And you don't have to read this whole paragraph here, but this is just for your reference. And about 116,000 species around the world have been assessed in terms of their conservation status. So it's a pretty small number, right, of the global database of species. But remarkably, of those 116,000, about 25% or so are threatened with extinction, right? And again, I don't want you to remember these percentages, everybody, but when we look at amphibians, 41% of amphibians are under threat, right? Are threatened with extinction. Mammals I've already talked about when we first got together, but there are a whole range of different species that are truly under the gun here. And on the bottom here, just for your reference, it's a very cool website. You can see the reference there, the IUCN-redlist.org. You can look at any species around the world and see its conservation status, right? And at the end here, there is those of least concerned. Then we've got endangered, right? Then we've got critically endangered, which means extinction is truly imminent. We've got extinct in the wild, and then we've got biologically extinct, functionally extinct, like the dodo. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? On the IUCN Red List of threatened species. Okay. So what are some of the common traits then, right? And there's a reason why I've got this photograph at the bottom, because I want to actually open up the floor here to a little bit of discussion and conversation, I hope, right? But there are some common traits that species that end up being threatened or endangered share. Now they don't. This list is not exhaustive, and it's not meant to imply that every species that is on the endangered or threatened list has all of these traits. But these are just some common ones, right? So very frequently we find that a species ends up on the endangered species list if it's got a small localized range. In other words, if it operates within a very small geographic area, right? It's got a very specific niche, and that's where it operates. That lends itself to a species being threatened or at least endangered, because if you impact that small range, then you dramatically impact the species. Another trait is these species may actually have an extensive range, but it may be significantly modified by humans. So, the California condor comes to mind for me, right? The California condor has a pretty wide range up the West Coast, but its range has been so modified by humans and industrialization that it is under threat. Island dwellers, right? Species that live on islands that are geographically isolated, right? So islands are problematic because immigration is hindered. It takes, considerable effort to get to an island. Think about the islands of Hawaii, right? Predators, diseases, when you bring in exotic species, that is enormously problematic. Species that have low reproductive success, okay? So species like the blue whale or the rhino, which we're going to get to talk about, they only have one calf, right? Other species have multiple, or species that are large and easily hunted, right? Especially species that, for whatever reason, are thought of as being valuable, whether that's valuable for consumption or valuable just, to have as a trophy. And I want to actually address that when we talk about rhinos in particular, okay? Because it's a very controversial topic, and I know in Texas a lot of people are hunters, and I want to make a very clear distinction when we talk about conservation about hunting and the difference between poaching and hunting. So let's just hold off on that. I'll come back to that. So those are just some of the common traits, right? That species that are under threat share or that they have. Okay. What's the greatest threat? Well, the greatest threat is habitat fragmentation, as we've talked about a little bit with deforestation, right? The fact that we have essentially cut up our landscape into a number of these islands, right? These isolated geographic islands. So this is a photograph of some of the tropical forest along the eastern coast of Australia, right? And so we've got these areas of intact tropical forest here. And then of course we've got these large areas of agriculture and a number of little patches here to try and keep biodiversity high, and also some of these connected spaces, right? These connected linkages, so that species can move and migrate, so that they're not so dramatically impacted. That, remember, the so-called edge effect are somewhat mitigated. But that's the reality. So when I talk about islands, I don't necessarily just mean islands in the middle of the ocean. We are a landscape of islands, okay? And I've made that point, I think, a couple of times. As humans have developed and population has gone up, as we've really changed from building fences to keep animals out, now we build them to keep animals in, so that we can go about our daily basis. And this is a very important area of research in ecology, is how do we connect these areas that are protected? And we do that through these things called biological corridors, right? So just as an example, we're working in the Eastern Cape of South Africa with a number of independent game reserves, but they are fenced and they are isolated. And we are trying to find ways to sort of take those fences down and connect these reserves so that the species can migrate. And that's proving enormously difficult. Why? Because a lot of this land here, in the case of where we're working, is farmland and owned by farmers, right? So you have to actually then have the money to buy that up and return that into protected areas. So these biological corridors can be small scale connectivity between reserves, or they can be much larger, right? Here's an example of a biological corridor along the Central American Isthmus. Okay, so we've got Mexico over here, and we've got Costa Rica there, Panama over here, and we go down into South America here. So this here is an incredibly important land bridge, right? That first emerged out of the Pacific and the Caribbean Sea about 1.5 million years ago. And what we're looking at here in green, these are existing protected areas, so state parks, national parks, and so on. And here's the northern part of Costa Rica, and here's the southern part of Costa Rica, right? So Costa Rica has a number of green areas of national parks. Anything in red is a set-aside biological corridor, either private land or identified as important corridors along which species can migrate. So there's always this ongoing conflict, right, between human land use and how do we set this land aside for nature. All right, so let me stop there and just see if there are any questions on that. All good. Okay, cool. So that was let's see, that was a quick 20 minutes, nice. So what I want to do now is just take the next half an hour, the next 40 minutes, to talk about a particular conservation strategy, and this is obviously going to be rhinos and what we're doing in South Africa. Let me just stop the share here for a sec, because I forgot to do something. And the thing I forgot to do was click that thing that will allow me to play the sound. Okay, are we back on slide deck? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me just, thank you. Let me just take that back then. All right, I just had to reshare that because I forgot to click the share sound. All right. So, anybody heard of the Rhino Initiative here at TCU? Nobody? Yeah, Claire, you've heard of it? Oh yeah, Claire, I know you've heard of it. I got your application for the Rhino Initiative Club. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, you talked about it in lab.
Oh, you've talked about it in lab? Okay, cool.
Yes.
How much did James do in lab? I should have asked him that.
He did a really good amount. It was like on what part?
Oh, on the Rhino Initiative?
Oh, yeah, he talked about it for a good 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. All right. I didn't realize that. I should have coordinated it then. Well, I'm going to expand upon that and talk about it for a little more because it's really close to. We've got time to do it, and it's close to my heart. And one of the things I want to just say right up front as we go through this is I don't want to give the impression that everything is just about rhinos, right? What I want to do as we go through this is I want you to think about using this species as a proxy for all species, right? So some of the and certainly the issues that surround rhinos are, I mean, some of them are shared with things like elephants and pangolins, but some are not, right? There's some other issues that are specific to other species, right? So we use the rhino as kind of a keystone species, and I don't mean keystone in the ecologic sense that, you know, the rhinos are the cornerstone, the foundational cornerstone of ecosystems, but just as an important species, one that has really gotten the world's attention, but I think speaks a lot to some of the challenges we face in terms of that overriding question, and that is how do we protect our natural heritage, right? So some of this may be a little bit more review at the outset before we go on, but just to illustrate a few things here. There are 5 rhino species. I don't know if James talked about these 5 species very much, but just to make you aware, there are 5 species of rhino. 2 of them are in Africa, and these are the 2 that we're working with, right? So the white rhino and the black rhino are the 2 African rhinos. There are 3 Asian species of rhino. I don't work specifically with the Asian species. The colors here represent whether the species is endangered or not. Red means critically endangered. Yellow means threatened, right? According to the IUCN, okay? So, and these numbers, incidentally, are, you know, a little controversial in the sense that we have a reasonable sense as to how many rhinos are left on the planet, but it's not an exact, right? So let's start on the left here. You can see white rhinos number currently about 14, maybe 15,000. They are in Africa. Black rhinos are critically endangered. They have, the latest estimates I saw were 3,500 of them, right? They are critically endangered because these are highly prized in terms of poachers for their horns. The greater one-horned rhino, this is the one in the photograph that you're actually looking at here on the left-hand side here. This is the reason why this is not critically endangered is because it's actually fairly well protected across Nepal and India. There's about 2,700 of them just in one game reserve alone, the Kaziranga Game Reserve in India, and it's pretty well protected. About 700 to 800 are in Chitwan in Nepal, but that's the greater one-horn. The 2 species that they're not extinct, but they're functionally extinct almost. I mean, the Sumatran rhino, there are about 80, some say less than 70 now, and the Javan rhino is somewhere in the region of 50 to 60, 58 to 68 is the official count, somewhere in there. The photograph on the right here you see is the Sumatran rhino. So this is a rhino that occurs on the islands of Sumatra, and there are some of them in a very small park in Borneo, the Javan rhino on the island of Java in Indonesia, all in one little tiny park called Uljon Kalan. So at the end of the day, you know, we've got about 20 or so thousand of these animals left. Estimates a century ago put rhinos in the region of 500 to 750,000, somewhere like that. So this is an animal that is under enormous pressure, right? And it's under pressure because of illegal poaching for the horn. Okay, so what's going on here? Let me just reiterate the situation. Let me go back a second. My computer is acting very, very strangely at the moment. So South Africa, my home country, is home to almost 80% of the world's rhinos, right? Those black and white rhinos, the 17,000. Most of those are in South Africa. There are some in Zimbabwe and Namibia and a few other countries, but South Africa is truly the key country when it comes to rhinos. In 2013, South Africa lost 13 rhinos due to poaching. That number of 13 was pretty average for 20 or 30 years. But then things started to change post 2007. And by 2012, that number had increased to 668. For the next 5 years, from 2013 onwards, South Africa lost over 1,000 rhinos. Each one of these little icons represents a rhino, right? So what we saw was this catastrophic ramping up of poaching in South Africa, which really caught people by surprise, right? It really put South Africans on the back foot. By 2010, 2011, there was just mass confusion, to be honest, about what was going on, why this was happening, and importantly, how they could begin to mobilize law enforcement, game reserves to try and deal with this. This 5-year period, right, 2014 to 2018, where we see over 5,000, what that equates to is a rhino poached about every 10 hours, about every 8 to 10 hours, right, which is an enormously sobering thought, I think. So when we meet tomorrow morning, another 2 somewhere will have been poached. The last couple of years have been really interesting, right? When we looked at 2019, poaching was down, right? This was the first year that poaching had fallen below 1,000. This is just in South Africa. So 594 in South Africa in 2019. In 2020, 394, right? So there's a really kind of debate going on at the moment in the conservation community in South Africa. And that debate centers around whether these numbers, whether this decline is real or not, right? Is it truly representative of the anti-poaching procedures and all of this kind of, again, mobilization of law enforcement to try and protect these animals? A bit of a double-edged sword. 2020, the numbers we think are dramatically skewed because of COVID, right? South Africa shut down and still is in, it's just come out of level 4 shutdown. So the poaching networks, right? People weren't allowed to drive on the roads between various provinces. And so this very well-constructed, interconnected network of crime syndicates working in South Africa to move these horns around was just simply not there in 2020. The other issue here is that as we've seen more and more rhino poached, there are less rhino to poach. And so there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of concern that even though the numbers are now starting to decline, if we just go back to the 2019 number of 500, 5 to 600, we think that still represents a pretty high percentage of the number of rhinos poached because there just simply are fewer. The National Park Service came out a while back and just confirmed that the Kruger National Park, which is our iconic nature reserve in the northeastern part of the country, it's about the size of the state of Israel. Those rhino numbers are down by 60% since 2013. So the onslaught continues, even though it looks like potentially we might be turning a corner here. That may not be the case. Does that make sense to everybody? Please interject or ask questions here. For some reason, my annotating thing is not working, so not quite sure why that's the case. Okay. So what's going on? So we've got, we've got a source country or a series of source countries here. So here is, when you look at the graphic here, the light brown countries stretching from the Democratic Republic of Congo all the way down to South Africa. These are the countries of concern for poaching and transit. South Africa, remember, again, is the key one, home to 80% of all rhinos in the world. There's Kruger National Park, that little green slither there, that's the size of the state of Israel. So the source country of these horns is South Africa and several Southern African countries. And the transit routes is that these horns are being moved into Southeast Asia, in particular into Vietnam and into China. Here, as we see, this is the Kazaranga National Park, that's the greater one-horn rhino. The transit network is directly into China there. But the vast majority of these horns are moving into, and they're actually moving into northern Vietnam here, right on the Vietnam-China border. So there's a supply and there's a demand, right? And we've got to begin to tackle this from both ends of the spectrum. And the one thing, as I'll share with you in just a little bit, the one thing that gives me enormous hope and that I'm just incredibly proud of is our Vietnamese community here in Fort Worth, and in particular our Vietnamese Student Association on campus, have kind of really jumped in and have become a voice and a help both here and back home in Vietnam to try and get the message across that that our animals and our natural heritage in Africa are being decimated. Now, rhino horn has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for a long time. Okay, traditionally that horn would be ground up and used along with a bunch of other ingredients to reduce fever. But the use of horn in traditional Chinese medicine does not in any way explain the ramping up in poaching following 2007. So what happened? Well, a whole bunch of things happened following 2007. One is it has been used as a mixture for curing hangovers, and that's one of the kind of myths, that rhino horn has these properties that it can cure hangovers. Of course, rhino horn is just keratin, right? It's fingernail, so there's no evidence for that whatsoever. But when rumors spread and when there's money behind a particular product, then the demand goes up. And let me just say, these are not just random people walking around the African bush killing animals for their horns, right? These are very, very well organized crime syndicates around the world that are moving this product. There was also a politician apparently in Vietnam who went on TV and said that his colon cancer had been cured by consuming rhino horn. It's also a symbol of prestige and wealth. On the top right of this graphic here is a bracelet that is made out of the central part of the horn, which is darker than the outer part. And I'll show you the video in just a little bit to illustrate that. So there's a multiplicity of factors here that are all adding up to an enormous demand for a product that really just has no medicinal properties and is just seen as some sort of prestigious product. And of course, this is exacerbated by the fact that in South and Southeast Asia, people are getting wealthier, right? So they have more money to spend. It is part of a global network of illegal trafficking of wildlife. We don't know how much it costs. It's in the billions of dollars, right? We do know that terrorist networks like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram are involved in the arms trade to the poachers. Incidentally, those horns, it's such a sophisticated network, right? It's not the three poachers that go into a game reserve that kill the animal and take the horn off. They make a fraction, right, of the profits. It's the middle people and the end people in Southeast Asia that really make all the money. The price of horn at the moment, hard to estimate. It's still considerably more than platinum and gold, somewhere in the region of $60,000 to $70,000 a kilogram, right? So a person who's living in poverty in South Africa, you know, doesn't see a horn on the end of an animal. They're looking at basically a bar of gold, right? So there's just so much money in the trafficking of wildlife that it continues at the expense of our natural heritage. Any thoughts or comments? Any questions? Makes sense, right? So we've got this incredibly sophisticated global network of poaching. Okay, so what are we doing here at TCU? How is this? What's this Rhino initiative all about? Again, apparently James may have talked a little bit about this. So what I've colored here in Africa are the supply countries and India as well, to a lesser extent, because the greater one-horned is fairly well protected. We've got the demand countries, right, of Vietnam, China, and surrounding South Asia. Okay, and then here we are in Fort Worth. So I started this initiative in 2014, and the reason I started it was because I wanted to give back somehow to South Africa, right? As you know, I was born and raised there, love the place, and you know, for 25 years, I kept thinking about, well, I'm living this very lucky and blessed life in the United States. How do we give back? And I got some money through the university to start this initiative. I just wanted to do something around conservation. I didn't want to do something around politics or anything like that. I wanted somehow to find a way to leverage the resources of our community. So TCU, Fort Worth, Texas. How do we use the resources we have to help with a real issue back in my country? So this started in 2014. We brought a wildlife vet, Dr. William Folds, an amazing guy from South Africa. He is one of the landowners, one of the game reserve owners, and he's also a wildlife vet down in South Africa. We brought him to campus here, and he spent a week here educating us about the rhino crisis. This was right in the middle of the highest poaching numbers. He had personally lost several rhinos on his game reserve, and we brought him here to sort of help him, right? How do we help him both intellectually think about how to solve this crisis, but also how do we raise funds and awareness here? It's been a privilege to do this, to be honest with you all. It's been a remarkable journey for me and for our students. We started our first study abroad in South Africa in 2015, and that's what I envisaged at the outset, is that we would take students to South Africa and immerse them in the game reserve for 10 days, work with the animals, do procedures on these animals, but also unpack this rhino crisis and think about ways in which we can help. For those of you who will be around TCU for another year or so, I cannot recommend, and I'm biased, I'll admit that I'm biased, but I cannot recommend highly enough that if you are able to, and we have really good funding to help people, if you're able to go on the study abroad program next year, assuming that it runs, and I'm almost certain that it will, it's a life-changing experience. So this is where we're working. This is the Amakhala Game Reserve. I've shown you this picture before. It's a private game reserve in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. It's about 8,500 hectares large, the area that has all of the sort of big five game. It's not your traditional kind of what I think some people view as the African savanna, the grasslands, things like that. It's scrubby. It's actually quite similar if you drive down through hill country. There's topography, there's the scrubby thicket, it's beautifully managed. It's managed by a group of ecologists, right, that keep the populations managed and under control, and we move animals between reserves to increase the genetic diversity and so on. But it's stocked with, you know, all the usual suspects. This is the male and the female lion that watch over, you know, watch over their kingdom. And we've worked on both of these creatures. This is my favorite of all. I mean, I should say rhinos are my favorite, but these to me are the most magnificent animals on the planet. I don't know if any of you have been to a reserve or have been close to elephants, but they truly are remarkable. So here's what we're trying to do at TCU in this initiative. There are 5 buckets, there are 5 bubbles here, and each one of these tackles a particular issue that we think collectively is critical to preserving the species. One of these we actually don't work with, and you'll see why in a second. So the TCU Rhino Initiative focuses on 5 areas, right? One is awareness. I'll just go back to that a second. So awareness, both here in the US and in Vietnam and in South Africa. So awareness is a broad initiative, and I'm going to touch on 4 of these just briefly. So awareness is one area that we focus on. Rhino management is another. This rhino that you see in the center of the picture here is a very special animal. Her name is Tundi. She was a rhino that was poached in 2011. You can see that she's got a big scar on her face, right? And Dr. Folds saved her, did multiple skin grafts on this animal, raised a lot of money around the world for her to put her through the pain and these procedures to save her. Her horn won't grow back because it was cut too deep. But remarkably, she survived. And more than remarkably, she had a baby. And now she's had 3. That was a photograph I took of her with her little baby about a month out. So that was one of the coolest things I've ever experienced, to think about a rhino that had been saved and then had actually had a rhino that should never have been born. So rhino management is the second area that we work on. This is the third area that is critical, law enforcement. We don't work on law enforcement, right, for obvious reasons. You know, it's tricky to go out and raise money to fund police and buy guns to apprehend poachers. So that's an area that we set aside and we leave to local law enforcement. Protection is one area, another area that we help with, and community, right? These are the 5 buckets that we believe all have to be addressed to save the species. It cannot just be about putting up fences, arming poachers, and getting dogs to chase poachers down, right? It has to be all 5 of these working together. As I say, we don't do the law enforcement. So these are the 4 that the TCU Rhino Initiative works on, focuses on. So let me touch on each one of these. So awareness is one. As I said, awareness is an issue that starts locally and moves globally, right? This photograph here is a photograph of a group of school kids in South Africa that had never been onto a game reserve. Many of the kids of families that live close to these game reserves have never been onto a game reserve. They see these animals as something sort of distant, as they see these animals as the white man's rhino. You know, wealthy people from the United States and Europe come to view them, and they don't have any, you know, vested control or gain from these animals. And part of that, to be honest, is still the legacy of apartheid, right? The fact that so many people were marginalized and never got to experience the beauty of these animals. So we help fund a program that brings kids in from surrounding schools and gives them an awareness and exposure to the majesty of these animals. So awareness on the ground in South Africa, and then also awareness back in Vietnam and China. I had, again, the privilege of working with a number of different schools in Hanoi on rhino conservation. And you know, the younger generations absolutely get it. They're aware, they understand, they want to help. It's just how does that information then, you know, permeate up through to the end user. We spend a lot of time on rhino management. So for those who go on the Rhino Initiative trip, these are the types of procedures we do. You'll notice this rhino, and I'll show you some video in a second of this footage. You'll notice this rhino has its horns have been cut off and then ground down. We do rhino dehorning as a preemptive measure, not on the reserves that we're working with, because it's not a procedure we do lightly. But some reserves choose to dehorn their rhinos, and if they don't have the money for anti-poaching units and they want their rhinos dehorned, then we help with that. But when I say rhino management, we work on a whole range of procedures. Very often the procedures are to change the color of a rhino because we track them. We know where they are, and so we have to attach a collar to them. You know, we fund all of those procedures. On the left here is one of my students, Sophie. A rhino had got her foot caught in an old snare and had ripped her foot open. And so we helped on the closing up of that. On the right, well, you can see what he's doing, right? On the right, we're doing a pregnancy test on a rhino. And before you can do a pregnancy test on a rhino, you have to clean her out. And there's only one way to do that, and that's to get a very, very, very long glove and find a volunteer who's willing to go in there and do it. And it's an absolutely awesome experience. But that's what we're doing there. We're doing a pregnancy. We're working here predominantly with white rhinos. So white rhinos are a little larger than blacks. Whites are about 2.5 tons. Incidentally, I don't know if James told you this, but that has nothing to do with the color of their skin, right? White rhino is a rhino that has a big wide front lip because the Afrikaans word or the Dutch word for a wide lip is bit, and the British colonialists thought they were talking about white. So they called the white rhino, the bit rhino, the white rhino with a big square lip, and it's a grazer. It just walks across and eats grass. The black rhino is a little smaller, about 1.5 tons, and it has a much more pointier nose, and it's a browser. It goes up into the thorn bushes. So I thought I'd show you just quickly what a procedure looks like. Some video footage here. So this is Dr. Folds in a helicopter. Is that going? Can someone just give me a thumbs up? Are you seeing that helicopter going? Is it flying? Thanks, Kylie, Claire, thank you. So this is Will flying around Amakala. You'll see the rhinos here. This is a crash is what they're called. It's a crash of white rhinos. And he's going to put the dart in. You'll see the dart go in, and then you'll see a slow motion. It's a gas gun with a long needle. Here we go. So there it is. He fires now. The dart goes in. You'll see the slow motion. There goes the dart. You'll see a pink fluff right there. So this contains an opioid, incredibly powerful, called etorphine or M99. You don't have to worry about that detail. That process takes about 5 minutes, right? From the time that the dart goes into the animal, it's down within 4 to 5 minutes. It's 5 little tiny drops of the opioid, and it is about 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. Then what we got to do is you got to get to the animal quickly, right? Because invariably it will fall, as you can see here, with its legs underneath it, and you've got to get its legs out. So we put ropes around the head and ropes around the leg, and then we put a tranquilizer in that keeps the animal in a kind of semi-suspended state, right? It's not completely out because we've got to keep circulation going. So you put earplugs into the rhino, you put the blindfold over just to try and keep it calm. At the back, Toby is working on the pulse. We take blood samples from the rhino. We check the notch in the ear just to make sure that we're working on a particular one. They're all notched. And then the procedure starts, right? Whatever that procedure is. This one was changing the collar on a rhino. You've got to keep track of its oxygen. You've got to keep track of all of its vital signs. You've got to treat the dart wound and all of that. And that process can take 35 to, 30 to 45 minutes, somewhere in there, depending on if the rhino wakes up. That's absolutely fine. You've got to let it wake up and let it walk a little bit, and then you just administer a bit more of the drug to get it back down. Once the procedure is over, then they put in a reversal, and it takes a minute, less than a minute, and the rhino's back up. White rhinos are very docile, very chilled, very laid back. Black rhinos are a whole different animal, literally. So we don't do black rhinos with students because it's a bit too much of an adrenaline rush. When they wake up, they just want to charge. They want to run into something, and they want to run into something quickly. So we don't do that, but white rhinos are a little easier to work with. So this is a rhino that we had dehorned on one occasion. So again, the procedure is the same. You dart the animal, you bring it down, you do everything. Only the owner or the wildlife vet can dehorn the rhino. This is what that looks like. Okay. Notice when this horn comes off, and you can see on the bottom here, everybody, that darker central core that I talked about, that's got a bit more melanin in it. So as this horn comes off here, 3, 2, 1, you'll see the darker core, right? That's the most prized section, at least for jewelry, right? That horn gets taken off above the growth plate. So in the bottom of, right at the bottom here, you can see that black line there is a Sharpie that the vet has indicated where the horn needs to come off. If you cut it off here with an inch left, it causes no pain to the animal, but that horn does regrow over time, right? If you cut it into the growth plate here, which is what the poachers want to do, they want to get as much of that material out as you can, then invariably the animal will bleed out. These are 2 rhinos that had been dehorned, and they were just getting up, and yeah, it was a very emotional procedure. They look different, right? I don't know how you folks feel or would feel, but there's the rhino without its horn, right? And that owner had chosen to do that. And then finally, the other area that we work with is protection. We spend a lot of time raising funds for protection that includes, keeping the fences up. On the right-hand side here is Sammy, a Belgian Malinois. On the left-hand side is Ella. She's a cold scent dog. So we've got dog units on the ground. That all costs money, and they have to be especially trained, and the handlers have to be trained. Here's a short little video clip of some of the protection stuff.
We are boots on the ground, our dedicated anti-poaching team that patrols on foot and then with vehicles, specialized vehicles that go anywhere and everywhere on the reserve. Then we have our canine unit, which focuses on cold scent and hot scent with attack dogs. Then we have our Eye in the Sky project that focuses on ultralight planes in the area and monitoring our surroundings and the reserve. And then lastly, our specialized equipment, drones, thermal vision, night vision, and high caliber weapons. Amakala's anti-poaching unit's strongest point is our young, passionate, dedicated group of anti-poaching guys that go the extra mile. They put in very long hours, are out there 24/7, night and day, during the coldest weather, during the hottest weather, always there out protecting the rhino.
That's been the most eye-opening to me, is those long nights that the anti-poaching unit spends every single night in the game reserve. And this is just one of the rhinos that we're working on, taken from the drone. And then finally, let me just talk about this. This is often overlooked. This is kind of the 4th area that we work on, which is community. Right? These reserves are surrounded by communities, right? By villages, small towns, sometimes very small communities. And those communities are enormously vulnerable, in the sense that when the poaching syndicates move into a region, they go into the communities and they say to people in the communities, look, You don't have to come and poach with us. You just have to tell us where the rhinos are. And they make so much money as informants. And, you know, for the most part, they're living in these communities. Some don't have electricity. Some don't, you know, have very little access to potable water. So there's this incredible sort of disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And when huge cash flows into a community through poaching, it's very hard. It's very hard to dislodge that. So working with communities, getting them involved in wildlife conservation is key. A survey was done of children in the communities around all of these reserves in the Eastern Cape, and over 90% of them had never even visited a reserve, right? So that's really what we kind of spend our time on. You don't have to worry about the bottom diagram over here, just to give you a visual sense. My last comment, and then I'd like to see if there are any questions on that. I know I've gone through this pretty quickly. The last point here relates to something that I talked about a little earlier on when it comes to the biodiversity, right? And that is the depressing news in many ways is that there's just not enough money to go around, right? So this was a paper almost 10 years ago now. And the big red bubble on the right here is the estimated global cost of conservation, okay? Just what it would cost to conserve the current land-based mammals. Okay, so this is not to put another, you know, million hectares under conservation. This is just the cost to conserve the current land-based mammals, and it's an estimate, 76 billion a year. On the left here are bubbles that show you the conservation spend per country annually. The US spends by far and away the most in terms of conserving species, but the rest are very, very small amounts. Look at China and Brazil, you know, I mean, they're tiny, tiny numbers here relative to the amount that is spent on so much else. And I would argue wasted on so many other things. And it's very, very complicated, folks, because when we talk about conservation, right, and wanting to spend more money to save animals, I know that conservation is laced with, you know, all sorts of ethics and what do we save and how do we save it and all that kind of thing. I get all that, but I always try and fight for spending more money on conservation than less. Okay, I've gone on long here. Let me stop and see if there are any questions on biodiversity and rhino. Thoughts, comments, questions? Nobody, must be something.
How often do those anti-poachers like catch poachers? Are there all gunfights all the time?
Yeah, no, great question, Duncan. So in the Eastern Cape, it's infrequent because we've been lucky, Duncan, that the poaching numbers have actually been pretty low in the Eastern Cape. Up in the Kruger National Park, I got a tweet this morning that 2 were apprehended in the Kruger National Park this morning. So that's becoming much more frequent than it used to be. The syndicates are so, they estimate that there are anywhere between 10 to 15 poaching syndicates in the Kruger National Park at any given time, right? Because again, it's a national park the size of Israel, right? So it's a huge area to try and protect. But they are apprehending them, and more importantly, Duncan, they're not only apprehending them now, they're actually making those arrests and convictions stick. Which has been something that has been very difficult to do in the past, to actually, because you can't just, if you're going to apprehend a poacher, it's not, in South Africa, the constitution is so tightly bound that you can't just kill a poacher, you'll be up for murder. When you apprehend a poacher, unless you're being fired upon, you have to catch them, literally you have to catch them with the horn and the axe in their hands. You know, so it's very, very tough. Botswana is a different issue, right? Botswana, they don't worry about that. If they see a poacher, it's free range. So, but yeah, it's starting. They're starting to see and they're starting to see significant sentences as well. Someone was sentenced to 27 years last week for possession of rhino horns.
Yeah, well, I remember I used to read about if they did catch them, they'd basically just be released right out. Like they would not have to stay in jail, so they just go back to poaching.
Yeah, right. And they apply for bail, so they get bail and they're straight out. That's been so disheartening, but it's changing. Last year there was a gang in the Eastern Cape called the Ndlovu gang. 3 people that they know had been poaching in the Eastern Cape, and that they were responsible for the deaths of at least 40 rhinos. They were never really able to nab them, but they finally did. And then, to your point, Duncan, they were put in jail. They didn't get bail. They were put on trial, and they were convicted. And they're sitting. They got 20 years. So, we're seeing some traction there in the success of the anti-poaching units, for sure. Any other questions or comments?
Professor, I don't know if you answered this earlier, but when you're dealing with the diplomatic relations, I know that Vietnam came over and signed a bilateral initiative in 2013. Did that create anything, or was it really about the same afterwards?
It's a good question, Kylie. There's a lot of examples of that that create goodwill, and it's a hard one to answer because the poaching is ongoing, and but I think my assessment would be that we have seen some results from things like that, right? And especially the awareness campaigns that I saw personally in Hanoi. I wasn't down in Ho Chi Minh City, but when I was in Hanoi, the schools that I went to, the university that I went to, and then some of the billboards that I saw around town, right? The billboards from famous Vietnamese pop singers that are getting involved, business people. The Vietnamese business community is really rallying around this, right? So I think yes is the answer to that, but it's kind of slow going, Kylie, because there just is so much money involved in it,
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Anything else? All good. Okay. All right, we are back. Let's set wildlife and biodiversity and forests and things to the side for a moment and change and head into chapter 9. So soil degradation, right? Soil and or land degradation, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two. So I think going from rhinos, which is probably pretty glamorous, to soils may not seem very glamorous, right? But I would argue that this is our most precious resource of all. If we don't have soil, then we don't have anything to grow our food in. And I'll also say right off the bat, everyone, that as an environmental issue, soil degradation, soil loss, soil erosion, the chemical and physical destruction of our soils is one of those issues that I always think of it as one that nickels and dimes you to death. Why does it nickel and dime you to death? Because it's not something that happens quickly. It is something that is sort of slow and unremitting and insidious, but eventually it catches up to you, right? And that's one of the things I want to try and impress upon you today. The soil material, we'll probably just spend the rest of this morning. I'll give you an introduction to the basic science behind soil. Then tomorrow we'll come back and we'll look at soil degradation in more detail, and then we will introduce you to the water crisis as well. So it's a little bit of kind of overlapping it, well, not overlapping, but continuation across lectures. Okay, so I know most people think of soil as just dirt, right? But it isn't, right? President Roosevelt, FDR, had a famous quote: "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And we're seeing many parts of the world that have enormous pressures on the land from a soils perspective, right? Not having enough high quality soil to grow the food and do the things that they need to do. Now, soil fulfills a variety of functions. Okay? We tend to think of the primary function as the one on the left-hand side here, right? So soil is the medium in which we grow things, but it fulfills a variety of other functions, okay? It is the place in which nutrients are cycled. It's obviously a habitat for organisms. Water is purified and filtrated through soil. It's an engineering medium for building things. It is a remarkable substance that fulfills a number of roles in society here. I love this little quote from a book called The Secret Life of Soil. If any of you want to read this, please let me know and I'll send you the reference, right? But healthy soil is a jungle of voracious creatures eating and pooping and reproducing their way towards glorious soil fertility. The amount of organic material, the number of organisms in soil is absolutely astounding, right? This little statistic on the bottom here, 1 teaspoonful of soil contains about 1 billion bacteria, several yards of fungal filaments, several thousand protozoa, and scores of nematodes, little tiny microscopic worms, right? It is an incredible substance, and that's why we can grow things in it. So the take-home message for soils, from my perspective, is that we'd better look after it, right? This is a resource that we'd better focus on, otherwise we're undoubtedly going to be in trouble. Okay. So what are the aspects of the basic science of soil that I'd like you to know? Well, this is important, right? When we look at a soil profile, so if you're driving down the road and you go through a road cut and you see exposed soil, this is the most obvious aspect of soils, the sort of building blocks of soil science, which are these soil horizons, right? They each mean something. Okay, these soil horizons don't just spontaneously appear. So what I would like you to know, what I expect you to know for the exam on Thursday, is what each of these horizons are, and very basically what they mean, what they represent, right? So this here is an important diagram. Okay, you're going to get to see something like this on Thursday morning. Excuse me. All right, so the big distinction here, and so the beauty of the soil horizonation system is that it is extremely simple, and there are only 6 major soil horizons. Now there are lots and lots and lots of variations on this, but at a first cut, there are 6 major soil horizons, okay? 2 of which are surface horizons, and 4 of which are subsurface horizons. So let me just point out what these are and say something about each one. But also let me say at the outset here that you will not find all 6 of these horizons together in one particular soil. That would be, I'm trying to think, would it be highly unusual? I can't think of any soil that I'm aware of that would contain all 6 of these horizons. Okay, so when you see these horizons, what do they mean? Well, the 2 surface horizons, the top one is the O horizon, okay? And that's easy because it stands for organic, O for organic. So an organic horizon, everybody, is a soil horizon that is rich in organic material, okay? Either fallen leaves and organisms, or the partial or the complete decomposition of that organic material, right? So leaves and organisms accumulate in the soil, and then they decompose, and they decompose from organic material ultimately into this very, very rich, sticky, fertile stuff called humus, okay? So that's the kind of black, dark, very, very rich material that is critical in terms of stability and structure and nutrient cycling, okay? So an O horizon, you don't need to remember this, but I'll just make this comment. An O horizon has to have at least 25% of the material made up of some sort of decomposed organic material, right? So incredibly high organic material contents. If you're walking around the wetlands of Louisiana, okay, that swampy, peaty surface would be an O horizon, okay? The second surface horizon, but the most important agriculturally, are A horizons, right? So the A horizon is what we widely think of as topsoil. And so if you're going down to your local Callaway nursery and you're buying some topsoil for your garden or your plants, you're buying material from the A horizon with some organic material incorporated into it. It almost always, in certain circumstances, this is not true, but it almost always has some sort of organic matter incorporated into it, much less than the O horizon. But it's also made up of inorganic materials, sediments, right? So clays, silts, and sands, all mixed together into this surface horizon called the A horizon. So those two are the surface horizons, O and A. Okay? Then we've got 4 subsurface horizons. So material from the top here, from the O's and the A's, is washed downwards as rainfall infiltrates into the soil. That material is washed down and begins to accumulate in the subsoil, okay? Let me deal with this one first. The first subsoil horizon is an E horizon, and that is only found in certain regions, right? The E horizon, the technical term, just for interest's sake, is known as eluvial with an E. And an eluvial horizon means material has been washed out of it, okay? So the E horizon is a zone of leaching. Leaching is the technical term for nutrients and fine material being washed out, okay, leached out of the soil, okay? And what's left behind is an infertile, coarse, sandy, white, bleached horizon, okay, the E horizon. So it's a subsurface horizon that is subject to significant leaching or washing out, okay? Which means it does occur in areas that have higher rainfall, okay? So you've got to have higher rainfall to wash that material out. And it's also got to have areas that have materials that have high permeability, okay? So that that rainfall can actually infiltrate through and wash the material out. So it's only found in certain areas, and you'll see an example of which in a second. But whilst I said the A horizon is the most significant topsoil horizon, the B horizon is the most significant subsoil. Okay, so that's the B horizon is what we consider subsoil. It is a zone of accumulation. It's where the iron, the aluminium, the humic compounds, clays, fine materials from above, from the A and from the E's, is washed down and accumulates, right? So it's a zone of accumulation. Everybody with me? Okay. The next subsurface horizon, let's go to the bottom here, right? This is the R horizon. Easy, simple, and straightforward. That's bedrock. Okay? Bedrock that has been unaltered, right? And then the final soil horizon is the C horizon, okay? The C horizon. So this is going to require just a little bit of explanation because the C horizon is a bit more complex. What is the C horizon? So the C horizon is known as the parent material, right? The parent material. This is the material in which the soil forming processes operate, okay? So it is the genesis point, the starting point of the soil. Now, why is the parent material potentially complicated? Because the parent material can be material derived from the bedrock, right? So think of this, everybody. I don't know if you've walked around the TCU campus very much, but if you walked down towards Pascal High School, okay, and you walk around many of the river valleys here, you see a whole lot of limestone outcrops, right? What's limestone? How is limestone formed? Anybody done geology 10113? What type of rock is limestone? Nobody?
I have no idea.
Okay, so limestone is a sedimentary rock, right? Limestone is a sedimentary rock, and it's formed from marine organisms that settle out, okay, and get compacted and converted into rock, calcium carbonate, right? The makeup of limestone is CaCO3, calcium carbonate, okay? It's a sedimentary rock laid down in ancient oceans. So Texas was once covered with ocean, right? That ocean came and it disappeared, and it came and it disappeared, and it laid down all these sediments. So you see a lot of whitish limestone around here, right, as a sedimentary rock. If that limestone, which is technically an R horizon, if it starts getting broken down, the process of which we call weathering. So if that limestone starts getting broken down by wind and water into smaller and smaller and smaller bits, okay, those broken down bedrock particles would be the sea horizon. It would be the parent material in which the soil can form, right? That's an important point. And that soil that develops in that sea horizon would be called a residual soil, right? Why is it a residual soil? It's a residual soil, everybody, because the parent material is being formed by the weathering of the bedrock right underneath, in situ, on site, at that place. So you've got the bedrock that's exposed, then it starts breaking down into smaller bits and pieces, and it builds up this layer of fine particles, fine material, in which the soil forming processes can then operate, right? Does that make sense? Or, so that's one type of parent material, okay? Or what you could have is you could have bedrock. So let's say you've got an R horizon sitting here, and let's just say that's limestone, okay? And then what happens, let's say you have a large ancient flood, and that flood deposits, say, 5 feet of sand, right? So this is a river flood deposit sitting on top of the bedrock. The soil forming processes can then start in that sand, right? You can start raining in there, you can start, vegetation may take hold, and over time the soils develop in the sandy material. That soil is called a transported soil. TPT is shorthand for transport. That is a transported soil. In other words, the soil is developing in parent material that was transported in by this flood, okay, and bears no chemical resemblance to the bedrock underneath. So I want you to make sure that you're comfortable with that. We have two types of soils out there, basically. We've got residual soils that are developing from the bedrock right on site, or we've got transported soils, which are soils developing a material that's either been brought in by wind or by water or by ice or by gravity from somewhere else, right? Does that make sense, everybody? Any questions on that? So if I was to ask you, generally speaking, what soils do you think are thicker and more developed, transported soils or residual soils? Which soils would you expect to generally be quite a bit thicker and more developed, transported or residual, and why? Do you think? Think about that logically. Are transported soils thicker or thinner? If you're a farmer, would you generally want to have your soils in transported soils or residual soils? Someone give it a bash. I think I'll have to ask
Would-
that question.
Would it be the residual soil?
Okay, so give me your logic for that, Cole.
I mean, I just feel like because it's been there longer and
Okay.
it's like naturally from there, maybe it's
Okay. Anybody want to counter argue that? So they may be older, and I would support your answer from an age perspective. Okay. So residual soils tend to be older because they can only develop in the material from that bedrock hole that is weathering right under that location. So yeah, they're older, but transported soils tend to be much thicker, right? And the reason for that is that if you just look at the bedrock here, you have to break this bedrock down by weathering over long periods of time to produce the parent material. It's much easier for a river to flood and just go, I'm going to deposit 10 feet of sediment here. Does that make sense? Right? So transported soils tend to be thicker. Paul, you're correct in that residual soils tend to be older. And of the world's soils, something like 95% of the world's soils are all transported soils from material that's been moved around by wind, water, or ice over time. Okay, so transported soils are more significant. Now, in the US, we have two very important soils, okay, from an agricultural perspective. So these are the two soils that are our most important here in the US, right? So when we look at soil classification, and be thankful that this isn't a class on soil classification, because that is a long, tedious process to classify soils. But at a very simple level, at the first level, globally, soils can be classified into one of 12 so-called soil orders, right? So there are only 12 groups of soils. So that's cool, not many. And these two are the two most important. And each one of these soil orders, incidentally, ends in the word sol, okay? From the Latin solum, meaning soil, shocker, right? So they all end in sol. And this first one, that is by far the most significant agriculturally here in the US, is called a mollisol, okay? So mollisols are our most important agricultural soil. Why? One, they're thick, okay? And they contain a thick, dark A horizon. So here's the A horizon that you see here, and that is over here, that's 2 feet right there. So there is 24 inches of A horizon. Now you probably could look at that and say, well, hang on, that's dark and black, that must be an O horizon. No, an O horizon is very specific to very high organic material in places like Louisiana or the Everglades and so on, right? So this contains organic material, but it's at least 2 feet thick here, sitting over a B horizon down here. And the map here is what I want to just draw your attention to. The map shows the extent of mollisols in the US. And so in this, the dark browns, this area, 75% of the soils here are mollisols, right? So really, when you think about it, there is this huge swath of soils here, which are the mollisols. Boy, that coincides with what? Coincides with the breadbasket of the United States, right? Okay, so mollisols are agriculturally our most important soils. Here's the second, and so here's an example. This is a typical soil looking out over an Iowa cornfield, right? The next one, the second most significant soil, and it's the second one that I just want to mention here, is the ultisol, U-L-T-I, right? From the Latin ultimus. So what are ultisols? So ultisols are soils. Their most distinguishing characteristic is that they have an E, and I'm just highlighting that there, right? That is the E horizon sitting over a B. It's not as bright white as some others, but that's a white E horizon. So it's got a thin light A horizon at the top here, sitting over an E. And these are soils that are highly leached. That's why they're called ultrasols, ultimus. They are the end point of the leaching process. In other words, they've been exposed to rainfall for a long period of time, and that white horizon has developed because of all of that rainfall and permeable soils. And so it's no surprise, look where they are. Don't worry about the different colors here. That's just different. So where do we find ultrasols, right? We find ultrasols all here and all up here. Okay. So what do you think the parent material of ultrasols are? Ooh, I know this is not a soils class, but think about that for a moment. What do you think the parent material of ultrasols would be? The parent material, where's that being derived from? Do you think or do you think they are residual or transported? Ultrasols, residual or transported? And why? Come on, folks, think about it. Look where those soils occur. Residual or transported?
Probably transported.
I would agree. Now, why, Cole? Good for you.
Because it's like around the Mississippi River, but it's not like on the Mississippi River. Well, it kind of is actually.
Okay. No, that's
It's around a lot of like water. So
okay, so that's a really astute observation. So here comes the Mississippi, right? These are all ancient flood deposits from the Mississippi. Nicely done. Nicely done. Okay. What about these? What do you think these are? I don't want to keep picking on you, but good for you.
I mean, it could be from like the Gulf or just like general wetlands.
Yeah, those are old. They are from the Gulf. Those are old, sandy, ancient marine sediments, right? That have come in and gone out and come in and gone out. Excellent. Okay. So the point there, Cole, is that these are highly leached. What does that mean? Well, it means that they have to be permeable, right? If these are clays, that water isn't going to percolate through them, and you're not going to get the leaching, meaning you're not going to get the white E horizon left behind. So you've got high permeability in sandy sediments from marine sediments and from river sediments like the Mississippi. And then, of course, they're all sitting here in the southeast. So what's the climate like here? If you love humidity, you should probably move here, right? Moisture coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. Rainfall, and you've got the sediments. What does that leave behind? That leaves behind highly leached soils that are relatively acidic. Now, it doesn't mean to say you can't grow anything in them. Anybody want to have a bash at what agriculture we have down here from Georgia, South Carolina to North Carolina? What do we grow here? Do you think? Nick?
Probably peaches.
Yeah, well, there's peaches there.
Tobacco.
Tea, tobacco. Anything else?
Cotton.
There you go. I'm glad you said that. I was about to try and sing a John Denver song, but that would have aged me chronically. Nice, Hudson. Yeah, cotton, right? So we can grow things, but when we're growing, if we want to grow corn, okay, and other feed, we generally move to the Midwest where we have mollisols. Does that make sense, right? So these ultrasols, again, they're not dead soils by any stretch, but they ultimately drove farming westward, okay, as people started moving into the interior. So this is what an ultrasol looks like, okay? And this is tobacco in North Carolina. Oh, and just incidentally, I'll point this out because we're still going to talk about this next time. But this big orange patch in the middle here, this is an exposed B horizon due to long-term erosion in the region. Okay. You know what? I think I'm going to stop there. That's good for the science of soil, everybody. It's a good stopping point because where we go to next is the nuts and bolts of soil degradation. So we'll pick that up tomorrow. We'll talk about soil degradation. We'll take a break, and then we will go on to water. Let me just quickly, before I let you go, I'm not going to stop the recording, but let me just bring up here. Okay, so this is the review that I posted this morning, right? This is what I expect you to know for exam number 3, right? Your final exam. And so we do have, you know, we've got some of the climate change one. We talked a little bit about model predictions and outcomes and global warming and some of the evidence, right? But you can see one of the key ones here is an understanding of the latitudinal diversity gradient, how mountains impact that, and what a hotspot is, okay? What are the major drivers of deforestation, and why is the herringbone versus the clear cut, why is the herringbone more impactful than clear cutting, right? So that will just get you started. And then on Wednesday in our final class, I'll pull this back up and give you a bit more of a detailed look as to what I expect. But that should all be up under exam review number 3. Okay, questions, everybody?